Greetings and welcome to this morning's webinar, this evening's webinar, depending on where you are. I'm Charles Freeman, Senior Vice President for Asia at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We have a great lineup today and a really interesting panel. So we want to get started in a minute. Let me just say at the outset that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has long supported a robust U.S. China commercial relationship for very clear reasons. It's in the U.S. interests. It's in the interests of 1.4 billion Chinese people, and we definitely want to continue and expand that relationship. That said, the Chamber has for many years been very active in pointing out the challenges in that relationship. We have been at the forefront of recognizing when the Chinese model has created problems for not just our members, but for the U.S. interests generally. And we've been forthright in that to the extent that in 2017, 2018, the 301 investigation that led to the China tariffs. Actually, there were about 70 different references to studies that the Chamber has done. We've also done significant studies on decoupling, on the idea that the United States and China which are extremely interconnected economically, are actually disengaging. And we started in 2016 with an analysis of Chinese efforts to be self-reliant, which really were an effort to decouple from the U.S. economy. And we have done significant work since then on U.S. efforts to decouple. And we've done that with the Rhodium Group. And so we're very pleased that we are initiating this report, which we're issuing today, with the Rhodium Group, who, as many of you know, is one of the foremost econometric analysis firms looking at China issues in the United States. And we did this study largely to suggest that that the degree of interconnectedness between the United States and China creates a very complex relationship, such that efforts from the United States or China to decouple, to disengage, actually have perhaps unintended consequences and require surgical efforts to preserve, in the case of the United States, U.S. security interests rather than sledgehammers. And the study, as we'll let Dan Rosen, who I'll introduce, is focused on looking at 4 different sectors of the United States economy and the relationship with China, and examines the economic impact of decoupling in those 4 sectors. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dan Rosen and thank everybody for joining. Dan.
Charles, thank you so much. It's so good to be here with the Chamber today to talk to you about this body of work we've been doing. Lauren Glaudeman is with me, my partner in this project. Lauren's an associate director at Rhodium, and we have been working on this since late 2019, when we first got together with friends at the Chamber and said, hey, maybe we should think about doing something on this topic of decoupling that puts numbers back into the conversation, rather than just sentiment, because at that point, it seemed like it was more of a sentimental topic than an objective one. Here we are, like 15 months later, and we have a chance to share with you some of our thinking on this. This is a Chamber report. Rhodium is a contributing author to it. I'm going to describe some of the conclusions we came to. First of all, how did we get here? How on earth did we find ourselves having to spend this much time and effort talking about decoupling between the world's 2 largest economies? A couple framing thoughts that we develop in the report together to help tell that story. U.S. China engagement, right, which is the sort of other side of the coin from the decoupling we're talking about, a 4-decade-plus story. It was always contingent, though, contingent on economic convergence. The notion that in terms of our economic systems, we were moving closer together over time, not going systemically in opposite directions. And until I would say, the past 5 or 8 years, we could be, at Rhodium anyway, reasonably comfortable, as I think the chamber was too, that things weren't happening on the timetable we ideally would like, but ultimately we were continuing to head in that convergent direction. The evidence for that has gotten much more fraught and complicated over the past decade. Clear indications of stalling reform and opening in many areas, we can talk about that, and cross currents in the national security layer of the relationship and in politics, human rights and other things that are kind of overshadowing that progress that is happening. By the way, Lauren, when you move the cursor around, it's flashing that hand all over the screen, so a little distracting. Thank you. That change of what I would call the central tendency of convergence in Beijing has precipitated a sea change in thinking in Washington that we've all lived through now acutely for the past 4 or 5 years. Not just an American phenomenon, the conversation in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere, Canada, Australia, et cetera, even in China itself has evolved quite a bit. We now mostly have to stress and talk about the competitive aspects, the extremely competitive aspects, I might say, of the relationship rather than the convergent aspects. And we talk about systemic rivalry and questions about whether China's choices at home are intentionally or more likely inadvertently, presenting a real challenge to the our interests abroad. I often like to point out that old pragmatic American maxim that your freedom to swing your fist stops where my nose begins. And so the choices China's making at home are because of its size and in many ways its success, having more and more implications abroad that we now have to address. So we've had agreement in principle among most, worldly people that we have some issues here that are going to require some adjustment in how permissive we are, plan to be in the future, et cetera. But we don't have a coherent toolbox for modeling decoupling, thinking about where it's necessary, where it's not, or importantly, anticipating and understanding the strategic side effects of some of that decoupling. So understanding U.S. China decoupling, the study we put out today in partnership with the Chamber, was started, as I said, late 2019, in order to illuminate those costs and address that. Next slide, Lauren. So the first question one has when one goes down this path is how to operationalize this, right? Which is a fancy word for, if you're going to analyze it, how are you going to do that? How are you going to define the problem and break it down? We know from the past decade that conventional Washington-style economic modeling of the benefits of globalization turned out to be woefully inadequate to describe the whole American experience. And in some ways, many of the political challenges we have today are because we over-relied on the numbers without fully considering the totality of the impacts of globalization on parts of our society and our community. And we have to recognize then that if we try to model and analyze objectively decoupling, the opposite tendency, we're going to be prone to making some of the same mistakes. So we have to start this with I think, real humility in joining together quantitative methodologies with more qualitative ways of understanding what it is we're talking about when we talk about decoupling here. And what we did first when Lauren and I turned to break this down was think about the major components of our economic interaction with China that would require some analysis, and to put those in context, not just what the effects will be in the future if we try to decouple, but where are we even right now? Like, what does the present stock taking look like of how engaged, interoperable with China we really are? And we broke it into these 4 components: trade, investment, people flows, and ideas flows. Some of these things lend themselves pretty well to economic modeling, trade, for example. Others, you can do an okay job of describing some of the interactions, like an investment, but there's a big kind of productivity, competitiveness aspect that's not well, represented in the empirical data and numbers, I would say. And then these other areas, understanding the importance of people flows to our economy and ideas flows, it's even harder to pin down really accurate numbers, I would say. So on this chart, we just show you how we introduce this journey for the reader, looking at how important China was to the United States economically in the year 2000, the lighter of the two blue bars, versus 2018, the most recent year we had full data available for when we got underway here, to show just how much we had deepened our engagement and our relationship. If we're going to do an adequate job of analyzing the potential costs of decoupling, we first have to put in context clearly how engaged, coupled we are presently. And that's the first task that the report sets out to do. And you see here kind of a sense of where we stand in that progression. Next slide, Lauren. We then introduce the variety of analytic options that economists have at their disposal to grapple with how big the potential decoupling impacts can be. And let me say, just for our introductory purposes here, that what we set out to do was not to do any original modeling. Rhodium Group does not do any original modeling in this study. All we do is look at other people's work and try to add it up a bit so that we can describe for the reader the magnitude and direction of likely effects if we try to pull our macroeconomies apart. And then, as I'll mention in a second, looking at that through the industry lens as well. But if we start to pull the economies apart, what are the kind of range of impacts likely to be? And here you just get a quick taste of sort of the magnitudes we're talking about in the trade space. If you took those tariffs that seemed like they were just a saber rattling exercise, 25% on everything, when we started this study, halfway through our effort, we realized that that's not just some crazy future possibility. That's where things were headed in 2019, 2020. And try to carry that through using traditional trade modeling, you get numbers like $190 billion a year of lost American economic activity due to the trade decoupling impacts. In investment, something like $25 billion of lost capital gains. And if you carry that through to the total loss of American asset values and the stock value of American business due to the ending the premise that we're going to be making money off China in the future, the kind of thing that Charles and Jeremy and the Chamber, exist to try to make sure Americans have a shot at that, you're talking about $500 billion hit on the potential value of what America Inc. is doing out there, right? In people flows, quickly get to, tens and tens of billions of dollars of lost American tourism revenue, education sector losses. And then you start to ask yourself, can we really build 5-nanometer fabs in America if we exclude all Chinese technicians and nationals from being part of the R&D cluster that needs to do that kind of work? So big people impacts. Ideas flows, the licensing of American technology, the interoperability of American technology, standard setting, all that has a big impact. Some of these things are more easily modeled than others, but we need to start pulling these things together into a unified, point of view so we can be responsible decouplers to the extent we decide we need to be decouplers. The other thing that's really important about this macroeconomic picture is that in addition to magnitude and direction of impacts being really crucial, we need to understand the relationships among these different factors between trade and people flows, between ideas and technology licensing and investment flows. Even European firms, for example, are going to be hesitant to invest in Silicon Valley if they feel they're going to be foreclosed, prohibited from deploying the fruits of their innovation activity in America to anything that might touch China and the world economy, right? It doesn't mean that we don't contemplate national security restrictions on what happens in American space. It does mean we have to understand the relationships, interrelationships, and connections among all these things. Next slide, Lauren. This is particularly important when we take it down a big step from the macro aggregate picture to the industry picture. One of my mentors at the Peterson Institute when I was a kid growing up there as a research analyst told me to always remember the economist who drowns in a river that's only 1 inch deep on average, which is to say that the aggregate overall average picture isn't the whole story. And indeed, whatever we think of as the net impact on America from decoupling could be much more acutely felt in one industry than another. And those two average out to make it seem like, you know, whatever the impacts are going to be, it's survivable, we can deal with it. But it could be much, much more acute than that when we take it and look at it through industry lens. We did 4 deep dives into 4 industries to give this study more immediacy, more qualitative relevance and salience to all of you reading and to the people who are going to be reading it after the launch today. Aviation, semiconductors, chemicals, and medical devices. And there are some numbers here that describe, again, the magnitude and sort of range of impacts that we could identify, not being industry specialists, but talking at great length and doing interviews with people in each of these industries to get a sense of how decoupling was likely to land in their sector, right? But just as important as those commercial economic impacts on them, each of these 4 industries is crucial to our national security welfare too, which is the original impulse for contemplating decoupling in the first place, right? And yet, when we look backwards now at some of the major decoupling initiatives of the past couple of years, we can assure you that nobody did a careful econometric or quantitative assessment of how pulling back on aviation would impact our national security considerations if those companies got weaker as a result of them having to pull back from China while, say, their European or Japanese competitors were able to make up that market share, have greater economies of scale as a result, right? Again, none of this means we don't need to be making national security our first order of concern. It does mean we need to understand the interrelationships, and this study is a step toward doing that. Next slide. We start to draw some observations, mostly discussion and debate, rather than settling anything, I would say, with this study, for long-term risks for the American interest. And those include concerns about lost comparative advantage if we have less economy of scale and scope as a result of starting down a path of decoupling without thinking through the interrelationships among things. That gives us less standard setting power for new technologies at the cutting edge, at the margin, especially if we don't bring other like-minded nations along. Supply chain replacement costs. I would say that there wasn't really even a basic economic impact assessment of decoupling 1.0 from the 2017 to 2020 period, let alone was there a careful think through of what the follow-on cost to American businesses would be if they were required to fully substitute out for anything that got close to China and rebuild those capabilities abroad. Some of that stuff does need to happen, is happening anyway for a whole variety of reasons, but some of it is not going to be cost efficient for American firms to rebuild things that are never going to be reasonable to try to make in America, for example. Again, it doesn't mean we don't act, but it does mean we need to do the accounting carefully so we understand the implications. And finally, loss of international trust. If the U.S. unilaterally erects barriers to economic engagement with China, that has run-on effects for us with third countries as a reliable supplier to them, as America as an investment destination for innovators and firms from those countries. We often think of the fact that German automobile manufacturers based in America exporting to China were caught up in our dragnet here the past couple of years in ways that they hadn't bet on when they decided to put their factories, cutting edge factories, in the United States. Last slide, Lauren, and then I'm gonna pause in my initial presentation, Charles, and hand it back to you for maybe a question or two before we turn to the panel. Policymaker implications. Again, we, more than even usual for Rhodium, we always try to be somewhat humble, believe it or not, but this one more than most, a lot of humility, because what we set out to do in 2019 was use the baseline of past U.S. China economic relationships and patterns to try to provide an accurate projection of what the change going forward was going to be, so that we could have a more inclusive, a more reasonable, estimate of what the decoupling total cost was going to be. And then COVID hit, and all of our traditional baselines of U.S. China are out the window. So any economist who tells you they're going to offer a precise calculation of what decoupling means in terms of the butcher's bill for the American interest is not being straight with you. It just cannot be done right now under the current global disrupted circumstances. But we can nonetheless start to draw some good high-level principles that are really crucial for our new set of policymakers to fully digest and keep in mind, and for our business strategists and business policymakers and advisors to think about as well. First of all, data analysis is critical to policymaking. We will not make policies that are in the American interest if we do not attend to data analysis. There was something of an instinct in recent years that we knew what we needed to do, and any conversation with an economist was just going to slow us down and get in the way of moving in a robust American red-blooded way. We are only now realizing how much we're going to have to mop up a mess from moving a little bit prematurely in some ways. You got to use data as a guide to good policy. Secondly, full decoupling, by which I mean if we were to try to cut off everything, or the preponderance of our economic engagement with China, would be so expensive that it would make everyone, even the most hawkish Americans and national security professionals, very uncomfortable. We're going to have to pay for this stuff. Our choices are not going to be cheap, even if we're selective in our policymaking decisions about re-engineering our economic engagement with China. We really have to be mindful that we've got a lot of economic priorities that we're going to have to pay for. Climate change, for example, dealing with transition and infrastructure in America, for example, pandemic preparedness. This is going to be expensive. We're going to have a better sense of what the cost is so that we can be judicious in what we do and what we don't do. Thirdly, just using China protective tools to try to address the diagnosis for what is the American concern would be a mistake. There's a broad spectrum of policies we need to be thinking of in terms of shoring up our competitiveness, our education, making sure America remains competitive. We don't have too much over-concentration of market power. All those kinds of things are part of the mix. It's not just about China policies, right? Especially when we think about the high price tag of decoupling, we really have to be mindful of cheaper, better ways to spread the burden of getting us to where we want to go beyond just thinking about tough on China measures. Fourth and finally here, we need international partners. No nation can address the China challenges we have defined, the legitimate challenges, right, alone. It's just not going to work. There is no unilateral option. The unilateral approach is going to bankrupt too many great American companies that should be quite the opposite, continue to be the leaders of innovation in a like-minded cohort of firms and nations around the world. Doing this plurilaterally is really the only smart way to proceed. And I think that's obvious to everybody on this call. And yet we still have some pretty big decisions to make in the year or two ahead about what we're going to do just based on a narrow definition of the American best way to proceed versus slowing down and doing things in a more inclusive way with other allies and friends and like-minded partners out there. Charles, I hope that sets the table pretty well. The study has a lot of detail in it, some of which we're going to, I'm sure, turn to in the next panel. But let me hand it back to you to take the first swing at the ball.
Thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate it. That's terrific. And I think for questions and answers, if you can put your questions in the Q&A, we can get to it. But let me ask Dan, while we're waiting to see what kind of questions emerge, other than one, which is, will you share your slides? Which I think the answer is yes. The question I have is, why did we choose kind of an absolute approach to decoupling for these sectors? Well, when some might say, well, that's not realistic. we're not going to get to full decoupling? Why did we look at a kind of complete decoupling approach in these sectors?
When we started this, there were still a lot of voices, including in the business community, that didn't think it was responsible even to talk about limited decoupling, because that really was a kind of distraction to the negative side, which was just going to be a minor part of the story. And mostly we just needed to get back to engagement as we knew it as quickly as possible. Within the first 5 months of the study, it became clear that the base case was not just the sort of partial tariff approach that Trump administration had started with, but we were already either stumbling or I guess clawing our way to a much more robust package of decoupling. With the change of administration, it's pretty clear there's going to be more tests for purposefulness before we take any more really aggressive decoupling steps. But enough questions have been raised about the United States as a reliable supplier, I would say, that it's absolutely not, at all are we out of the woods for people starting to move away from the presumption of getting back to a kind of sustainable engagement with China going forward. So, it's entirely possible that without even intending it, we're going to see this sort of glide path towards somewhat less interoperability between the United States and China. And finally on this, I would say that we can only be as interoperable as China chooses to be systemically convergent.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if Beijing chooses to decree from political body what market shares are going to be for foreign companies, for Chinese companies, industry by industry, how many Chinese national champions are going to be, then how much, even if we really want to, can we get back to the kind of convergence toward a more engaging future that we'd all like to see? So there needs to be some changed mindset on our part, but I'm even more concerned about what the systemic direction is that China chooses to take. It has to be compatible with our sort of OECD market-oriented mindset in order for us to get back to where we want to go.
Got it. Let me just choose. There's a few questions. Let me choose a couple. Your intro, this is a question from Steve Schlaker. Your intro slides show a $500 billion one-time reduction in U.S. GDP, presumably, in addition to ongoing annual GDP losses due to reduced U.S. investment in China. Please explain the dynamics of a one-time GDP loss versus ongoing GDP losses.
Well, look, what the study does is walk through the whole spectrum of different economic approaches to grappling with what the effects of decoupling are likely to be. As we've just been discussing, Charles, nobody even agrees with whether there's a prospect of a kind of fulsome decoupling in the years ahead, or really, some people are still arguing that decoupling is a myth. It's not really taking place. In fact, we have an appendix and a considerable part of the study that describes a very long list of steps that have already been taken in ways in which trade, investment, people flows, and ideas flows have already been partially decoupled. Such the question is, can we reverse some of those, especially the ones that are not necessarily supportive of the American national security interest? So when you think about what are the economic methodologies available to try to project out, just how deleterious that's going to be to the American interest, you have everything from, very narrow, slight consumer welfare losses because our import prices are a little higher, to at the other extreme, the whole value of listed American enterprise, right, predicated on accessing the global market. If China is 30 or 40% of marginal global growth over the next 2 decades, and America chooses gratuitously and alone to pull back from that and cede to European competitors the opportunity to sell into that market, it's really quite a modest number to imagine that $500 billion of American, value, equity value, right? And investments that we make every day are going to shrink in a really significant way. In fact, what you'll find in the study is the sort of wonky analysis relating the investments that American companies make in America every day, which is part of annual GDP and output, right? And how that relates to our ability to be global investors abroad, especially where the growth is, and that is in China. So that set of numbers you will find in the report has to do with that relationship between the work American companies do to be in the markets where the growth is happening, like China, and how that relates to investments, employment, output, activity we have back here in the United States.
Got it. Thank you. Mark Cohen asks, and then let me turn it over to Jeremy for to start the next panel. What advice would you offer the Biden administration on how to best structure economic analysis and/or incorporate econometric support for policy decisions, particularly as the administration looks to alter previous administration's policy? Who should do the work? BEA, USITC, USTR, other agencies? How should it be collected and leveraged? Through an ITC study, confidential submissions, a more public discussion? What's your advice there?
You know, I think when you, and by the way, the slides are going to be available for sure. Most of that work is already in the report. You'll be able to find it online as of the launch a few minutes ago. And the table that describes the sort of kitchen sink, if you will, from trade to investment to people to ideas, right? Each of those different threads, sub-channels that we, Lauren and team looked at each of those and asked what kinds of research and methodologies are available for us to grapple with effects in this area, and then in this area, and then in this area, and this area. They are, a whole spectrum of different kinds of research, different kinds of methods, different departments and parts of government, and different researchers in the private sector and academia who are doing different parts of that work. So it's not like there's one ready-made entity that is set up to do the net assessment of how to think about this. I think there's going to need to be a coordinated effort. I, having spent 1 year at the National Economic Council many years ago under Lael Brainerd and Gene Sperling at that time, I would love to see this run out of the White House by the new team there at the Enticon entity to make sure that ITC, the new capabilities at USTR, which are very exciting as well, all these things are brought together. There's quite a bit. A lot of the most impactful new research done in the past 4 years that I think there's going to be continuity with actually did come out of the Department of Defense as well. There's the Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis there and other nodes, right, that are part of the analytic community that have, because after all, it's not just a commercial analysis we're talking about. We do have to continue to form an integrated assessment now that considers commercial interests and national security interests at the same time and try to solve those together so that we're not seeing this, as we have to sacrifice the one in order to have the other. If we don't have both, we're going to lose this. We're not going to serve the American interests if we don't consider commercial interests and national security interests at the same time. So it's going to take a new kind of consortium that involves not just the set of economic analysts that Mark just referred to, but also folks on the security side who traditionally didn't necessarily sit together with their economic brothers and sisters. So it's going to be somewhat new.
Thanks, Dan. Let me pause there and turn it over to Jeremy for the next panel. I think we're going to have a brief pause while we get set up for that panel, but let me thank Dan, you for not just answering questions today in your presentation, but for the great work. And let me turn it over now to Jeremy Waterman. Thanks, Dan.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you, Dan, and Lauren as well for leading us off this morning. Terrific presentation, Dan, and I want to thank you and Lauren in particular for your tremendous work on the report. And also, Dan, to you specifically for your partnership over many years. Going back at least a decade, I think this is our 4th collaboration with Rhodium on issues spanning infrastructure, or maybe even our fifth report, investment, and a series of reports on decoupling. I noticed there were some questions about the implications of decoupling for China and China's economy. And I would point all on this call to the 2016 report that we worked on together with Rhodium as well as Covington and Burling, that outlines the economic cost to the Chinese economy, or the cost to the Chinese economy of decoupling, in a very detailed, both economic and qualitative analysis. I also, just briefly before we move to our panel, I want to recognize the China Center team, Jocelyn Chan, Ben Jacobs, and Ellie Goldshire, all of whom worked very hard on today's event and the report. And a special thank you, I think he's listening today, to Chris Gregg, previously on our team and now at Stryker, who played a critical role in working with the Rhodium team and industry players on the substance of this report. A big thank you to Chris. As Charles mentioned, we're now going to move from the macro to the micro, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to moderate our next session on industry perspectives. And in that regard, we're very fortunate and privileged to have a senior and highly experienced group of industry executives and analysts to share their views on the Chamber's report and the broader topic of decoupling with China. And so, in alphabetical order, very pleased to have with us first Godfrey Firth, who is the General Manager for International Accounts of GE Healthcare China. He's the commercial leader for all foreign invested healthcare groups in China, including strategic projects involving investment by GE. He manages cross-border projects between China and customers around the globe. He has Mongolia as well. He's got more than 10 years experience at GE Healthcare China, managing all government policy, government outreach efforts for GE Healthcare China. And perhaps most important for some on this call, he's an alumnus, as am I, of the U.S. China Business Council. So welcome, Godfrey. Terrific to have you with us. Second, Chris John is the president and CEO of the American Chemistry Council, the leading association representing the over $550 billion U.S. chemicals industry. Chris is responsible for driving pro-growth, science-based public policy agenda that fosters the development of groundbreaking products to improve lives, create jobs and economic expansion, and enhance public and environmental health and safety. Chris joined ACC in 2019 after serving 6 years as president and CEO of the Fertilizer Institute, and for 7 years prior to that as president of the National Association of Chemical Distributors. Third, Scott Kennedy is a senior advisor and trustee chair in Chinese business and economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Scott is, I think, as all know and appreciate, a leading authority on Chinese economic policy and has been writing on China prolifically for over 30 years. He has tremendous experience and knowledge on industrial policy, Chinese industrial policy, technology capabilities and innovation, business lobbying, author of numerous reports, including work that touches on these issues directly on commercial aviation and medical devices. So terrific to have Scott with us. And certainly last but not least is John Newfour, the president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, where he's responsible for setting and leading SIA's public policy agenda and serving as the primary advocate for maintaining U.S. leadership in semiconductor design, manufacturing, and research. John has a distinguished experience. In the business community before joining SIA at ITI, and also in the government, where he was Deputy USTR for APEC and Deputy USTR for Japan. So each panelist has agreed to deliver opening comments of 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll move to Q&A. So what we'll do is we're going to start out with Chris John of ACC, then move to John on semiconductors. Godfrey will talk about medical equipment issues, and Scott will bat a very strong cleanup with some framing comments on commercial aviation. So with that, Chris, over to you for your opening comments.
Sorry, I don't think there is sound coming from Chris.
Yeah, Chris, we can't hear you.
How about now? Is that okay? Well, I was off to an amazing start, and sorry, so I'll just reboot that. Apologies. This is the era in which we live, right? So I want to thank the Chamber and the Rhodium Group for this important report, as well as this panel this morning. You know, it highlights some things in our space, for example, that probably aren't part of the dominant narrative regarding China right now, but perhaps should be. You know, our industry has been one of the major bright spots of the economy over the past decade here in the United States. And so for the American Chemistry Council and our members, this report is fundamentally about market access. And market access is essential to protecting our competitive advantage, to growing our exports, and creating and sustaining American jobs that depend on those exports. So market access has really helped us fuel the shale gas and manufacturing renaissance over the past decade. Since 2010, for example, our industry alone has announced more than $200 billion worth of chemical manufacturing investments in the United States, accounting for more than half of U.S. manufacturing construction during that time. And these announcements were largely predicated on our country's ability to be able to export to our largest trading partners, including China. So losing access to those export markets not only would limit jobs, but also the growth potential of our current facilities already up and running, but they also put investments in the planning phase still at risk. And you know, we've got about half of those facilities in play, and the other half are in the planning phase. And so what we don't want to do is put those at risk. And so increasing market access and growing our exports is really, that's the first part of the story, but imports also matter. And we respectfully disagree with those who see imports as a four-letter word. Our industry relies on select imports and intermediate inputs from China and other trading partners to strengthen our domestic manufacturing processes. And it also allows us to export more finished products overseas. In fact, 86% of chemical imports from China are used as intermediate inputs on US economic activities. So we've already seen how tariffs and other trade actions can hurt market access, both by reducing the demand for our exports overseas due to the increased cost, but also making it more expensive to import essential intermediate inputs from China. So we've seen since 2017, for example, US chemical and plastics exports to China have declined by over $1.5 billion. So as we look to work with the Biden administration going forward, and it is looking to create jobs and invest in green technology for innovation, for example, that address things like climate change, it's clear that a strong, thriving chemical industry is an essential part of that equation. And in short, you can't address climate change without the business of chemistry. So when our members and our industry is competitive and succeeds, our downstream users, our downstream industries, which rely upon us, they'll also become more competitive and more successful. So again, I want to thank Jeremy, you and the folks at the Chamber and the Rhodium Group for putting this important report together, and look forward to the conversation this morning.
Terrific, Chris. Thank you. John, over to you for your opening comments.
Hey, Jeremy, how are we doing on the sound? Loud and clear. Excellent. So thanks to the U.S. Chamber's China Center for the kind invitation to speak. Really appreciate this. SIA was very happy to sponsor this important report, be one of the sponsors. A few top line reports, top line points on the report. Great move by the Chamber and great work by Dan and Lauren of the Rhodium Group. Fantastic report. It's critically important to wrap some credible numbers around the costs of decoupling and create some context for all the loose talk of decoupling that has seeped into the policy discussion in recent years. So the report does a lot in taking us down that road, and really appreciate that. Selecting chips as a focus for the study made all sorts of sense. I know my perspective may be a little biased here, but our industry is critically important to the nation. It's important to all of us.
I think I can safely say that semiconductors are the foundation of everything digital and exciting happening in our lives. Our cell phones, social media, AI, 5G, autonomous driving, quantum computing, toasters, you name it, semiconductors are in them. More immediately, semiconductors have played a big role in helping us tackle the pandemic challenges, from helping find treatments for COVID to care for patients. It's helped us work, and semiconductors have helped us work and study remotely, and helped us buy groceries online. So again, another example of why chips are so critical to us in our lives. For us in the semiconductor industry, the decoupling question has focused heavily on the deployment of controls on exports to China. And the report effectively teases out the risks here and how these controls, if used without careful consideration for their impact on the ability of the U.S. semiconductor industry to innovate and stay at the head of the pack, can significantly undermine America's longstanding global preeminence in this sector. So China, not surprisingly, is the world's largest market for semiconductors and accounts for about 35% of our revenues. That's pretty big. As the report points out, partial or complete decoupling with China would entail some very significant costs. It's projected to lead to an 8 to 18% decrease in American chip firms' global market share, resulting in significant R&D cuts and capital expenditures, as well as cost up to 124,000 U.S. jobs. You know, a key point here is that the U.S. semiconductor industry invests about 1/5 of its revenues into R&D. And it is one of the most research R&D intensive industries in the world, right up there with pharmaceuticals. So when you start cutting off capital profits that can flow into R&D, many of them coming from the huge Chinese market, you really undermine our ability to stay at the tip of the spear in terms of semiconductor innovation. Let's see here. The report supports the idea that the long-term answer here when it comes to competing with China is that we turbocharge U.S. innovation through open markets, protecting our very valuable IT, which is critically important for semiconductors, of course, and strengthening our workforce. But another very important leg of the stool is that we need robust federal investments that incentivize chip manufacturing on U.S. soil and bolster basic and applied research in semiconductors. So it should come as no surprise that we are big supporters of the CHIPS Act. And I know many people on this call are also supporters of the CHIPS Act, which also should come as no surprise, since chips go into so much of our electronics and things that are important for our daily lives and for our national security. So while we got some good progress on the CHIPS Act about a month ago when it was passed in Congress, programs were authorized, but they were not appropriated. And that's going to be our next big battle, to get money wrapped around the CHIPS Act provisions that incentivize manufacturing on U.S. soil and federal investments in semiconductor research. So again, Jeremy, great job on this report. The Chamber, great job on this report. It's a very valuable analytical tool that's going to help us explain to folks why, when measures that lead towards decoupling are contemplated, why you have to factor in the cost to the U.S. economy. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, John. And to move to a consumer of chips, let's turn it over to Godfrey at GE to offer a perspective on the implications for medical devices and medical equipment.
Thanks, Jeremy. Can you hear me okay? Great. So look, it's a pleasure to be here this evening here in China as the only sort of panelist from the other side of the ocean at this stage. I think most of you are familiar with G&G Healthcare, but very quickly, we're the leading producer of complex life-saving medical equipment, such as MRI machines, CT scanners, X-rays, ultrasounds, and ventilators, with revenues of about 18 billion in 2020. We operate and manufacture all around the world, but at its core, GE Healthcare is a US company. Much of our medical equipment is designed and produced in the United States by 19,000 employees at 24 facilities in Wisconsin, South Carolina, Utah, and other locations. Exports from our facilities in Wisconsin alone support 4,000 US jobs based on estimates by the US Department of Commerce. We also support 1,000 additional jobs at the 6,000 US suppliers that help us out in one way or another. And I will say we also produce in China for the local and Asia Pacific market. MRI magnets, for example, weigh several tons, and it's hard to be competitive if you produce thousands of kilometers away from your customers. So while GE's headquarters are in the US, we have operations in more than 170 countries and make more than 60% of our sales outside of the US. And so GE has long supported free and fair trade between countries. China is an important market for us. We value customers and employees in both locations. Turning to medical devices, China's medical device market is the second largest in the world, ranking just behind the US, 78 billion in 2018. The market here has grown by double digits for over a decade, sustaining an average growth rate of 20% from 2014 to 2018, while the global medical services market global medical devices market grew by just 5.3% in the same time period. It's a huge market for GE Healthcare and other US medical device companies, and its importance will only increase as China ages. China will have over 300 million people over the age of 60 by 2025. That's in 4 years. And the burden of chronic disease is rising rapidly. Now, we're pleased to note that the Chinese hospitals and clinicians really remain eager to use US technology and the latest tools for diagnosis and treatment. In China, US medical device companies have about a 30% share of the market, which includes big equipment like what we make for hospitals, but also implantables and consumables as well. Much of that US presence supports both manufacturing and R&D jobs back in the US. Of course, there's competition. We face competition from Chinese companies and from European and Asian counterparts here in the market. If we were forced to decouple from China, as this report points out, we would lose a combined annual revenues of about 48 billion US dollars a year if we project the growth rate forward, leading to almost $500 billion US dollars of losses over 10 years, with corresponding impacts to our supply chains and thousands of suppliers across the United States. As most companies like GE in the US medical device sector, we spend about 7% of our revenue on R&D. That's a $33 billion reduction in R&D spend over a decade and a corresponding loss in competitiveness in cutting edge technology. European, Chinese, and other competitors would rapidly pick up our market share in China and then use those revenues to outinvest us. I think most importantly, however, improving people's health and saving lives has no borders, as COVID-19 has amply demonstrated. The Biden administration has mentioned public health as an area of potential US-China cooperation, and we support that effort. In our view, regardless of the ups and downs in our economic relationship, the healthcare relationship between the US and China is impossible to decouple. There's a long and positive history of Sino-US health-related collaborations. The top hospital in China, Peking Union Medical College, was originally founded in part by the Rockefeller Foundation. You know, I live here, and that history is keenly remembered here in China. The health challenges China faces are enormous, as are the resources being devoted to those challenges. US medical device companies should be active participants in this, not only from a commercial perspective, but more importantly, from a humanitarian one. Finally, COVID-19, cancer, cardiovascular disease, malaria, these are all common enemies. And China's investment in battling these enemies will result in important innovations to address these diseases. We would want and expect China to share those innovations with patients in the US. An open market in life-saving medical technology is one area where both sides should understand the benefits of cooperation over confrontation. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Godfrey. And finally, over to Scott for some thoughts, some framing comments on commercial aviation.
Thank you, Jeremy, and congratulations to Dan, Lauren, and the partnership that you all have with the Chamber for a great report. We've worked with Dan and Lauren and Rhodium on other reports, almost as many, and every one of them have been highly impactful. And so it's a real pleasure to be able to see another report that I can tell is gonna have a big impact in framing the conversation. I'll say, before I say something about aviation, let me say a little bit about the topic in general. And, you know, there are three kinds of ways that one can challenge a policy of decoupling. One is to ask about its costs. The second is, can it work? Does it isolate China, slow down its economy, reduce its leverage? Does it help the US economy? Does it help global institutions? And thirdly, does it help protect American national security relative to the status quo. Those are the sort of the three big ways one can talk about the strengths and weaknesses of decoupling. This current study focuses on the first question, the costs to the US if we go down this road. And I can say from someone who spent a lot of time looking at this question, as you know and mentioned, the Trump administration did essentially no math on this. Looked at very discrete, specific elements of some specific technologies, but they didn't do anything as comprehensive as what Dan and Lauren and you all have done today. Nor have they done anything like the IMF has been working, which is a general equilibrium model that says if you reduce trade overall between the US and China, what does that mean in terms of all the different elements that affect your GDP, not just for companies, but for workers and everything else. And so it's critical that we do the math and not make choices based on faith or ideology. And so I commend this study because you guys have done the math. It's not necessarily the final math calculations that need to be done, but now anyone that's going to participate in this conversation is going to have to do their own math. Otherwise, they don't deserve a seat at the table. In the case of aviation, I would say that outright decoupling, regardless of whether it's started by the US or started by the Chinese, would be insane. Just from an economic perspective. The current arrangement that the US now has in aviation with China lets the US have its cake and eat it too, right? The current framework is ideal for the United States. There's some improvements that need to be made, some adjustments, but overall, we are in an ideal situation. And the report lays out how quickly China's growing as a market for aviation relative to the rest of the world. And actually, since the report was written, post-pandemic, China's share of increase in travel, et cetera, is rising because their economy hasn't slowed relative to others. US has amazing amount of sales of aircraft, post-sales service. At the same time, much of our aircraft and the components are manufactured in the United States already. There's also this trade and business supports ancillary sectors in China, their airlines, their service providers, parts makers, financing, tourism and travel, which generates more demand for these aircraft and the services that come with them. In addition, China's efforts to develop their own aircraft are going extremely slowly. There's lots of media reports about the C919 and stuff, but we are, by what the US is doing, we are not quickly creating a competitor which is ready to push out the US quickly. There's a very long time horizon before the C919 has any chance of being a significant player in China or globally. So the US in the current framework maintains economic leadership and protects national security at the same time. And I could go into that in more detail. If the US were to heavily restrict aircraft sales or component sales to China across the board, the big winner would be Airbus. The big winner would be we would not be slowing down China's efforts to improve aviation or things like that, because we wouldn't be able to isolate China because Airbus would pick up a lot of the economic activity. I do think there are some improvements in policy we could have with regard to the national security side of the aviation industry, particularly regarding the technology around engines, as well as avionics and materials, but through targeted export controls, investment restrictions, monitoring, surveillance, we can protect those technologies while continuing to maintain leadership, which helps us economically and in terms of national security. I think the same story is relatively true across the sectors, including in medical devices, where I've also looked at where there's some kinds of important restrictions we may put in a targeted place, but in terms of overall, the broad framework now works to help maintain US technology leadership in these vital industries that don't just help companies and managerial boards and C-suites, but the American workforce in the communities in which they live.
Terrific, Scott. A great place to sort of end the opening comments and begin our conversation. And maybe what we can do is to sort of start off is talk about policy, the way the policy making process should really unfold, and how to have an optimized public-private partnership in terms of the policy making process and how that should unfold. And so I guess I would put to Chris first, but also I think, you know, John, you referenced the CHIPS Act and the work that SIA has been doing with partners in government to advance that. Obviously, there are ongoing discussions in the medical device space. And Scott, I know you have a perspective on this, but how should that policy-making process unfold, and what kind of trade policies, Chris, you know, at least for your sector, would you like to see come out of the Biden administration? It's come to our attention, for example, that there is this inconsistency between, on the one hand, the miscellaneous tariff bill, which removes tariffs on chemicals, and the Section 301 tariffs, which maintain tariffs on chemicals. I think that's sort of one inconsistency. So how should we, you know, in all of these areas, how should that policy-making process unfold in a way that will address government concerns as well as incorporate the private sector's realities in that context?
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. It's a great question, and I'll start right there on the MTB and the Section 301 tariffs. And it's a little bit schizophrenic in terms of its approach and doesn't make a lot of sense. So from our perspective, we ought to pass the miscellaneous tariff bills and suspend those duties on those essential imports, as I talked in my opening comments, that go into U.S. manufacturing processes. So the whole point of MTB, obviously, as you know, is to help U.S. companies be more competitive by allowing them to import those essential inputs. And then we turn around in the 301 process and then we slap some additional tariffs on them. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. So we need to fix that right out of the gate. I think the second thing we'd look for then is also to eliminate tariffs, potentially, you know, as I said, Section 301, but also the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum and harmful retaliatory tariffs as well. And then the final piece, which is a little bit different than kind of the tariff-driven policy that we've had in the past few years, is to look at, as I mentioned in my opening comments, the Biden administration's focus on climate change and sustainability in general. And we support those efforts to make trade part of a kind of a sensible and practical approach to those issues. You know, the innovations in chemistry are essential to curbing climate change, addressing sustainability. You know, our industry is all about innovation and technology and lightweight materials and building insulation and things like silicone ink that go into solar panels. And I could bore you to tears for the next 20 minutes about all of those innovations. But the point is, for every ton of CO2 that's emitted in the manufacturing process, we actually take 2 tons of CO2 out of the atmosphere based on the sustainability and carbon footprints of the products that our members produce. So we'd like to see trade policies that recognize that important role that chemistry plays on these global challenges and make it easier and less costly for us to export those innovative products across the world.
Great, thank you. John, over to you. Maybe you can, you all have taken a very proactive approach, I would say, certainly over the last year in working with policymakers. You know, you alluded to the support and the leadership role that SIA has played on the CHIPS Act. What thoughts do you have about sort of how policymaking should unfold in your area and more broadly under the Biden administration? And what advice would you offer perhaps to other industries based on, you know, the ongoing work that you're doing on the CHIPS Act?
Unmute, John.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for those questions, Jeremy. I think where we've been most successful with government has been pressing for an affirmative agenda. You know, we spent a lot of energy working on problems around export control, the tariffs, things like that. And, you know, these are important issues that government needs to pursue in a sensible way. But if we're talking about a successful future for our industry, it's going to be defined by our affirmative agenda, our ability to pedal faster and be the most innovative. And so we made good progress under the previous administration, under the CHIPS Act, and we are encouraged with the Biden administration's approach. One, it's very focused on making America more competitive. And that's very apparent in the transition documents and what the president has been talking about in his new team. The other piece of it is we're very welcoming that the administration is taking a pause to develop a coherent, comprehensive China strategy. You know, I think we didn't have enough of that before, and I think it's very beneficial that they're doing that. And then finally, kind of on the working level, a kind of a return to regular order when it comes to rolling out new regulations. You know, Friday evening regulations rolling out in kind of odd ways through press releases from departments that are rolling them out and not through the regular way that we're used to it. So a release of something would come out and none of us would see it for a while. And just to return to regular order where there's kind of robust, formalized discipline input from the private sector, I think could be very, very beneficial. And I sense that's the direction we're going.
Great. Godfrey, any comments from the perspective of GE and the medical device, medical equipment sector in terms of policymaking? You all obviously have been in the eye of the COVID storm and a lot of challenges in that regard. What do you see as the sort of affirmative agenda that John has alluded to, as well as the sort of need to kind of reconcile some of these inconsistencies in policy that we've seen that are leading perhaps unnecessarily to costs and burdens borne exclusively by U.S. industry?
Yeah, I mean, I spend most of my time watching the China government policy, but the U.S. side has certainly been, I would say, the source of a lot of the discussions that we've had on the China side over the past couple of years. I think, it was interesting that in 2018 and 2019, we had a lot of conversations with hospital customers about, the trade actions, what was going on. But in 2020, COVID-19 just erupted and eclipsed all of that. And really all it was about speed and making sure supply chain functions and how robust they were and what you could get done. And in the first quarter, it was all about China, and then it was all about helping the rest of the world. And we saw, I think, with ventilators as an example that, we were able to ramp up production quickly. And, U.S. our facility in Wisconsin was doubling its production capacity. We were able to support the needs, but that depended on the open flow of goods. And I think China was largely consistent in allowing kind of free flow of medical equipment in and out of the country throughout that period. So I think to kind of build on John's point, a return to kind of consistent and fact-based policymaking would be helpful for us. I mean, I think we need to understand that the medical device industry is not one that you can immediately nationalize in a single country. It's going to be in some cases interdependent and global. And how do we make that work to the best of both sides?
Well, maybe that's a good segue to sort of shift from policy making in the United States to policy making in China. And in fact, there have been a number of questions in the chat about sort of the space that China is leaving or not leaving to be coupled, to have a positive sum relationship. And in fact, I see that Sherry Carberry of Boeing, and thank you, Sherry, for staying up late if you're in fact in China right now, as well as others on the line for joining us. But maybe Scott, over to you, and I suspect Dan, you also as a longtime student and analyst of China will have a perspective on this. But what responsibility should China bear going forward to ensure we continue to be coupled? Obviously we have policies like dual circulation at a macro level, and then a whole range of industrial policies that we have commented on as the chamber together with Rhodium over many years, and certainly are front and center in this report as well. Sort of what if China no longer wants to be coupled, whether it be in, pick your sector, I guess. Scott, what's your sort of response there, and how the U.S. government should respond to that?
Sure. Certainly our concerns about China predate the most recent developments in Chinese policy that they've been talking about the last few months and are going to roll out in the 14th five-year plan, like dual circulation. The whole conversation in the United States about decoupling emerged because of Chinese state capitalism and mercantilism and lack of reciprocity, theft of IP. There's a lot of Chinese, the direction of Chinese economic policy is win-win, China win, US, China win twice. And obviously there's a lot of ways the US have benefited and still does and still can. But the antibodies that are producing this conversation in the United States emanate from China. And so that is a long-term challenge, and that is why the U.S. has been trying to figure out what to do. And so we lurched in one direction towards unilateral brinksmanship and conversations about decoupling and slashing supply chains. And that's going to continue as long as the Chinese continue to generate policies from Beijing and implement things in biased ways. And so there's a lot of areas our economies still are not coupled. In certain kinds of services, internet services, for example. There's no American versions of TikTok and WeChat in China, for example. And because we have this military competition, we have national security concerns that are quite serious. So I just want to use that comment to just connect back to the conversation in the last segment. I think everything everyone said about what U.S. policy should do going forward makes sense. I do, and so it needs to be a lot more, there needs to be more math, it needs to be more collaborative, organized, straightforward. I do think that there is an important role for industry to play in identifying what are the genuine real risks that the U.S. faces from connectivity to China, to our economy and to our national security, specifically what they are and what are the best ways in a targeted way to protect ourselves. I don't think anyone here is saying we ought to just have an unconditional relationship with China no matter what. But industry is in the best position to say, here are the genuine risks. Here's where our leadership is genuinely threatened. And here's the best, smartest ways to go about protecting ourselves. If they only just say no and let Washington come up with the negatives, the restrictions, then we'll get the type of restrictions which don't make sense. So I think industry needs to participate on both the positive side and on the limitation side in a smart way.
Great. Maybe Chris, I mean, your thoughts. I mean, I think probably Chris, you, John, and Godfrey. Godfrey is the only one on the ground who's actually who's working on making these sales sort of in the Chinese system and has some firsthand experience for sure. But Chris, what are your thoughts on sort of those challenges for the chemical industry in China? Maybe John, to you next, and then Godfrey, any thoughts that you want to share in terms of sort of your on the ground work and sort of, your perspective from Shanghai as to where kind of we are in decoupling, at least in the sort of health space or the medical sector, medical device sector.
Yeah, thank you, Jeremy. I'd echo Scott's comments there. I don't think anybody's saying we just ought to ignore some of the risks that come with this. And so my guess is that the chemical industry is not unique to the other folks on the panel and other industries that operate in China. We all face the same challenges of weak protection of intellectual property rights, including trade secrets, forced technology transfers, burdensome and intrusive cybersecurity measures, data localization requirements. Those are all well documented, and I think they're certainly present in risks in our space. I will say, having said that, and I like the way Scott put it, having more math and more fact-based versus ideological or faith-based approaches. For us, the retaliatory tariffs are still the major obstacle for us. So I don't want to lose that point, but I think that Scott's point is well-founded here.
John, any thoughts from the semiconductor industry?
Yeah, I think if there's, and this builds on what Scott said, is industry absolutely needs to be part of the solutions. Most industries are difficult for government to understand how our supply chains work, what our technologies are capable of. Semiconductor industry in particular is just awesomely and crazily complicated, both in what the technology is and what it can do, but also in how our supply chains work. And so, we are very much aware that if we sit back and let government try to find solutions, at the end of the day, all of us are hurt by that. So it's our obligation to step up and do that. And the other piece of it is, I mentioned earlier that 36% of our sales go into China. As the report aptly points out, our big exposure to China is that it's by far our largest customer. We do some assembly tests there, and there's a tiny bit of research that happens there. We build almost nothing there. There's only a couple of fabs there, U.S. fabs there. It's as a consumer market, and so whatever happens, it's just not an option. It would be disastrous for us to not have access to that massive and growing market. And so it's just critical that the Biden administration understand that and work backwards from there.
Dan, I think you maybe wanted to make a comment on this set of issues as well. So I forgive me, I was going to go to you and then I went on to Chris, but your comments on this sort of set of issues?
Nobody's going to make a mistake going to Chris, John, and Godfrey in this conversation, because this is precisely the point, that the sense of urgency in recent years inclined our leadership to make decisions without reference to what industry thought. And that in many ways is a lot like the way things work in China. And the problem with that we're talking about, the whole topic of decoupling, is because systemically, what seems like it's kicking butt in China today is actually predicated on building up so much debt, so many compromises to the interest of the Chinese people over time, that I don't believe that it's really desirable or sustainable, the direction that China is headed in, which is why we're talking about being less permissive in some ways, so that we preserve the way in which our system works differently, because we think it's more accretive to commercial value in the interest of our people over time. And precisely as John said, ground zero of that insight is that U.S. government or any government cannot make all these policy calls on their own. They need to understand what industry thinks. That's why the science of liberalism in the West is that you have to have a system in which industry and the people get to have due process and are involved in the policymaking process. You get better outcomes that way. It's not as fast as some interest groups want at times, whether it's the human rights community, the labor rights community, the national security community are not always so patient and tolerant of the way due process works. But over time, there's no proof that any system works better. So we got to get back to using what we know about data and due process to ensure that we come up with the best policy outcomes and choices over time, and not be distracted by the semblance of Chinese competitiveness today, so that we decide that we're going to, look past the niceties of our democracy. I think we've all learned the hard way in recent months and years that way lies disaster for us. So we've already figured out a lot here about what kind of corrections we need in the near term. The devil will be in the details. Administration tries to solve all this, all those wonky choices, some great questions in the Q&A stream. And this is just the beginning of the conversation, but I'm already considering it a massive success that we're starting to talk about the things we're talking about using this report as a springboard. So terrific stuff.
Great points, Dan. And last time I checked, for most policy, including international policy, but certainly domestic policy, we have this thing called the Office of Management and Budget, which is required under statute to actually weigh the costs and the benefits of any given policy. So that's obviously long been ingrained in sort of U.S. policymaking, in the U.S. policymaking structure and apparatus, and I think all agree that we need to, continue to rely on that approach to optimize good outcomes for the U.S. economy, for business, and for workers and the broader populace. Godfrey, you're sitting out there, and again, thank you, Godfrey. I know it's late there in Shanghai, but what's your perspective, sort of, being in Shanghai? Obviously, you're working on selling into the market, exporting to the market, putting deals together. Sort of, we hear a lot, obviously. One of the points of concern that we do hear about is this new Chinese policy of volume-based procurement. But what's your sort of take on the challenges that you face, as well as the opportunity? I think you alluded to some of those opportunities, but welcome your thoughts on the medical device piece in particular.
Sure, thanks, Jeremy. I mean, for all this sort of talk of the topic of the decoupling, for us here, for GE Healthcare in China, the market is still open. We're doing quite well. I mean, obviously last year was a unique year, but beyond that, in the earlier years, we're also still doing quite well here. I mean, that aside, it's also an extremely tough and competitive market. Everybody is here. The Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, of course, are all, over the past few years, they would go around and tell our Chinese customers, maybe you should consider non-US suppliers because of reliability and parts and other things that might be concerns. But, at the end of the day, as I said before, we have longstanding relationships with these hospitals, and most of them are mostly concerned about diagnosis and treatment. So this really hasn't got that much traction, right? And then, of course, there are the Chinese competitors who are coming up, and they will also, pay the patriotism card in supporting the home team. And again, we welcome that as well. I think it's, it's part of the competition, right? So I'd say just in general, from a day-to-day perspective, things haven't changed all that much, even 3 years into wherever we are now, right? On the domestic side, where we spend more attention is probably making sure the procurement process is fair, particularly at the very local level, like city or county government level. So, I think it's easy to get caught up in a kind of negative perspective on this, but it doesn't reflect the reality, at least that we're seeing. Volume-based procurement, that's mostly impacting consumable and implants companies, so it really doesn't affect us much. I wouldn't be the right person to speak to it, but I think, one thing I will say, and it's part of this discussion here, I'm sure you have, at 1 a.m. in the morning, you probably have a bunch of people from China on the phone here, because all eyes are on DC right now. Every trade move being made by the new administration is being watched with laser scrutiny from Beijing to Brussels, because it's been such an important factor over the past several years, and what happens next is critical. So I think there's obviously very important domestic concerns that go into this process, but I would just highlight for everybody who's in the US, what you do right now is going to be analyzed every different way it can from the other capitals about where we're headed.
Well, that's a great segue, and we've got about 7 minutes or so left, and a great segue into sort of both, I think, allied cooperation, and also, I think, Godfrey, as you alluded to, allied competition, right? You have all of the members of the chamber, the members of Chris's organization, John's organization. It's not just U.S. competition, U.S. competitors in the market, exporting to China, selling to China. So maybe you can each sort of offer a comment both on sort of the allied competition, how the companies in other countries benefit from U.S. decoupling policies and the burden that U.S. companies face, as well as sort of what we can do. Obviously, a key pillar of the Biden administration's approach. The Biden administration, president himself has made no bones about the point that he wants to work with others very intently to deal with the China challenge. And that's a central message, I think, of this report, as Dan highlighted in his opening comments. So maybe you can each offer a comment on both the sort of competition challenge and the burden you face when the US is acting sort of in this unilateral way, and how competitors benefit, and then what can be done in terms of cooperation. Scott, please go ahead.
Sure. You know, I think everyone knows, we've said so many times in so many different fora that the world's assessment of China is roughly similar, not just the US, but its allies, but we disagree on the solution set. And we need to come to grounds with that. And if we do things differently, then China uses divide and conquer, and we end up shooting ourselves in the foot. One of the challenges of a decoupling strategy is that you may seek to isolate China, but end up in a either fragmented world or isolating the US, and that's not the outcome that we would want, obviously. And so in the case of aviation, if the US unilaterally restricts sales of Boeing aircraft or parts from Honeywell and others, you've got Airbus and others in Europe ready to take up that business. Airbus has an assembly facility in Tianjin. They're localizing some of their production far more than Boeing, which has a finishing facility outside Shanghai, but is manufacturing primarily in the United States. And so if we go at that level, it's mainly competitive, but there are common concerns at the component level, engines, materials, avionics, where the US and Europe want to and need to maintain leadership in these technologies, some of which have dual use elements to them. And the conversations that we can have between the US, the EU, in some cases, Japanese are also important in this sector to make sure we're on the exact same page with regard to export controls, identifying the proper products, users, people, because they're vitally important, as we've seen in some espionage cases, and investment. So I think there's if it's going to be about aircraft to aircraft, it's going to be a competitive fight with our allies. If it's about components and how they're built, and then I think we've got much more common ground to work with others in aviation.
Chris, you want to maybe, or John first, and then Chris.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Just a couple of things, and again, teeing off what Scott just said. So semiconductors, we control about half the global market, but there's other huge competitors around the world in Korea, Japan, Taiwan. So we had kind of a rough experience on export control when we weren't coming up with multilateral solutions. We passed a tremendous market share to our non-Chinese overseas competitors, because there was not a multilateral approach taken by the last administration on export control. So I just think it's absolutely critical, export control and other ways to be collaborating with our allies. And there is a leadership vacuum out there. Our allies still are not willing to kind of take the role that we have in leading coalitions to try to address the China challenge. And so we need to step back into that role with eyes wide open. At the end of the day, our non-Chinese competitors, our allies, they don't necessarily see the world the same way, and it's going to be difficult. Building these coalitions is difficult. There's a lot of interest at stake, but I just think we have no other course, and we must take that course.
Chris?
Yeah, to piggyback on what John said there, in the chemical industry, because of the shale gas revolution, the United States is the second biggest chemical producer in the world. Well, guess who the biggest is China, right? So, and they're our third biggest trading partner, and it goes both ways. And so if we decouple, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so we can't see these opportunities to other countries. This tremendous investment that we've had in the past decade here in the United States has been predicated on this relationship going forward. And so our industry employs over 500,000 Americans at high-paying jobs. They all have healthcare, and we support another 5 million jobs in this country. So if you talk about benefits to the environment, you talk about employing Americans, decoupling would be a disaster from the chemicals industry's perspective.
Maybe what I can do here, Dan, I mean, again, you have been a leader on this throughout. I'm happy to give you sort of the last word. I mean, I think I think math and analytics, obviously, it's a huge, it's just immensely important. Mark Cohen alluded to this. What are your thoughts? Obviously, you have a lot of work that you do with the U.S. government. Obviously, we've partnered, but you know, how, obviously public-private, but what can be done going beyond this? I think everyone agrees this is, well, we agree it's a good report and certainly a helpful first step, but we're biased. But what more needs to be done with this new administration? How quickly do they need to do it? Take us home.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, and thanks again to the Chamber for the opportunity to do this, and to all your members too who make it possible to do all this stuff. I guess just to finish up this round and like look ahead to the next one, you know, I guess the bottom line is that math without context is a disaster, right? It causes you to jump into doing things that we've at times done in DC that turned out not to be adequately shared benefits for everybody in the country, and that can lead to political outcomes that, you know, none of us are comfortable with. But likewise, sentiment and context without math is equally disastrous, right? So we really do have to walk and chew gum at the same time. Obviously, politics is king right here in this moment, with nobody in leadership or aspiring to leadership wanting to get outflanked on who's tough on China, on this, that, and the other. We have a lot of really complicated questions here that's going to take, you know, leaders, leading women and men, to come together and have a diverse, inclusive conversation about, you know, what is the net national interest and how we deal with all these things. And meanwhile, by the way, there's a lot about China that we want to embrace, that we want to keep open to, keep on the green list, as we put it at Rhodium, so that we can benefit from what's happening in China, even while they make some mistakes there that we need to protect against. So it's too much just to neatly tie things up with a bow right now, but it's enough to say that getting both the math back to the table, but in the context of the industry experience and the sort of larger conversation that we're having, is absolutely the way forward. And there's, I think, lots of room, lots of low-hanging fruit to have engaged that conversation with the administration. Terrific people in there that are talking to us all about this stuff we know in lots of channels, and are open to lots more to come.
Terrific. And I should just note, I mean, there's so much we didn't touch today. I mean, Scott alluded to it a little bit in terms of his comments on aviation and the work he's done there, but understanding Chinese capabilities as well. I mean, obviously there's allied cooperation, but there's Chinese capabilities, which we haven't talked about in great detail, and having the resources in the U.S. government, the technologists and the experts to understand, to John's point, about the complexities of the technologies themselves, the supply chains, as well as Chinese capabilities. And there's certainly a lot of work going forward that needs to be done. I want to thank all of our panelists. Again, I want to thank Dan Yu and thank Lauren. I want to thank Chris, Greg again. This has been a terrific program, and we'll look forward to staying in touch and continuing to move the ball forward on these really important issues. So thank you all, and thanks to the audience for some great questions and feedback.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well done.
Thanks so much. Congratulations.
Thanks, Jeremy.